I was halfway through my trip when my phone rang. My parents' voices were filled with fake concern. "We sold your inherited home to help your pregnant sister. She needs it more than you do." I froze. "You did what? How could you sell my house without my permission?" I yelled. I canceled everything and rushed home, heart pounding with anger. The moment I stepped through the door, I looked them straight in the eye and laughed. Because the house they had sold wasn't theirs to sell. And they had no idea what was coming next. I never expected my own family to betray me like this. But looking back, I should have seen it coming. For as long as I can remember, my parents, Patricia and Robert Carter, made it clear that I was never their priority. That role belonged to my older sister, Emily. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the daughter they proudly paraded around. And me? I was the afterthought, the one who had to carve her own path without their approval or support. That's exactly what I did. While Emily spent her 20s jumping from one glamorous job to another, always landing softly thanks to our parents' money, I worked my way up in real estate development. I started small, flipping houses, managing rental properties, until I built a successful business on my own. Every brick, every contract, every deal, I did it without their help. Grandfather Henry was the only one who ever believed in me. He wasn't like my parents. He respected hard work. He never cared about appearances or playing favorites. When I was younger, he'd sit with me on the porch, talking about what it really meant to own something, not just a house, but a legacy. He would always say, "Ownership isn't just about having a roof over your head, Rebecca. It's about responsibility." I never understood what he meant back then, but now, standing in the very house he left to me, I understood it perfectly. This house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was the proof that I had built something real. It was my home, my sanctuary, the only place where I truly felt safe. Until my parents and Emily decided to take it from me. It started with a casual family dinner, a rare occurrence, and one I should have been suspicious about from the start. Emily and her husband, Daniel, showed up looking unusually smug, while my parents acted like they were about to deliver some exciting news. I didn't have to wait long. "Rebecca," my mother began, her voice sugary sweet, the way it always was when she was about to manipulate me. "We've been talking, and we've come to a decision about the house." I set down my fork, already feeling a knot form in my stomach. What decision? My father sighed like this was an exhausting conversation for him, like I was already being difficult before I even said a word. "Emily and Daniel need the house now, Rebecca. Emily is pregnant, and they need more space for the baby. You understand, don't you?" A cold silence settled over the room. I turned my gaze to Emily, who sat there smiling like a queen being handed her throne. Daniel, her husband, looked just as smug, his arm wrapped around her shoulders like they were the picture-perfect couple. I swallowed my anger, keeping my voice steady. "And what exactly am I supposed to do?" "You're always working," my mother said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You could get a condo, something more practical for your lifestyle. Emily and Daniel need a family home." I almost laughed. "You mean my family home? The one grandfather left to me?" Emily made a little noise of frustration. "Rebecca, don't be selfish. We're family." There it was. That word, family. The same word they always used when they needed something from me. Not when I needed help. Not when I was struggling to build my career. But when they needed me to step aside for Emily. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "No." My mother's smile vanished instantly. My father's jaw clenched. Emily's eyes widened like she couldn't believe I had the nerve to refuse. "Rebecca," my father said in a warning tone, "this isn't just about you. Emily is expecting. This is about the future of our family. Then she and Daniel should buy their own house like I did." Daniel finally spoke, his voice laced with thinly veiled arrogance. "We already sold our condo, Rebecca. We were counting on moving here." I raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe you should have talked to me before selling your place." That's when my mother pulled out the folder of documents, slapping it onto the table like she was delivering the final blow. "You don't own this house," she announced, her voice sharp now. Your grandfather kept our names on the deed for tax purposes. We signed everything over to Emily and Daniel yesterday. You have 1 week to move out. The room spun for a moment, but I kept my face neutral. 1 week to leave my own home? Emily leaned forward, trying to look sympathetic. We know this is sudden, but it's the best thing for everyone. Think about the baby, Rebecca. I stared at her, watching the way her hand rested on her stomach, the way she kept shifting uncomfortably under my gaze. Something wasn't right. I knew Emily. I knew her tells. And something about this whole situation felt forced. I just didn't know why. But I did know one thing. They thought they had already won. They had no idea what was coming next. I didn't react the way they expected. No shouting, no pleading. Just silence. For a few seconds, I let them believe they had me cornered. I could see Emily smirking, waiting for the moment I would break. My mother was already sifting through the papers, probably expecting me to start signing something. Maybe an agreement to vacate the house, maybe some twisted contract relinquishing my rights. But I wasn't playing their game. I exhaled slowly, stood up, and pushed my chair back. I need a moment. I walked away before any of them could protest. The second I stepped out of the dining room, I could hear them whispering. Emily was giddy. Daniel murmured something about handling this before she causes trouble. My parents weren't concerned about how I felt. They just wanted this done. They thought I was going upstairs to pack. They had no idea I was about to ruin their entire plan. The moment I reached my office, I locked the door behind me. My hands didn't shake as I pulled open my desk drawer, but my pulse pounded as I grabbed the thick envelope I had tucked away nearly 3 years ago. Inside was everything. The real deed. The one that proved my grandfather had transferred full ownership of the house to me long before he passed. He had told me about it one night, just weeks before he died. They're going to come for this house, Rebecca. I know my daughter. She never learned how to build something of her own. She only knows how to take. But I built this home with my own 2 hands, and I'm leaving it to the only person who understands its value. You. I hadn't told a soul. I had let them believe that their names were still on the paperwork. Let them think they still had control. Now they were about to realize how wrong they were. I walked back downstairs, calm and steady, returning to the dining room like nothing had happened. Emily looked up, expectant. Daniel, smug. My mother, victorious. My father, indifferent. I sat back down, placed my hands on the table, and then I set the envelope down. You might want to take a look at this before we talk about me leaving. My mother frowned, reaching hesitantly for the papers. My father took them instead, flipping through the pages. His expression darkened. Emily leaned over, reading over his shoulder. Her smirk faded. I sat back, watching the realization dawn on them. The deed was legally in my name. Their so-called sale to Emily and Daniel? Completely invalid. You knew? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. I gave her a slow nod. Grandfather transferred everything to me years ago. You can check with Mr. Williams, his lawyer. He notarized it himself. Silence. Then a sudden, panicked shuffle. My mother grabbed the papers, flipping through them like she could will them to change. My father clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the folder. Emily? She just sat there. Frozen. You let us go through with the sale, Daniel finally hissed. I turned my gaze to him. I found out about your little plan weeks ago. I wanted to see how far you'd go. Emily pushed back from the table abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is a mistake, she insisted, looking between our parents. Fix this. There's nothing to fix, I said smoothly. The house isn't yours. It was never yours. And legally, it can't be sold without my signature. Emily turned to my mother, her voice rising in desperation. Mom, do something. But for the first time, my mother didn't have an immediate answer. She looked pale, shaken. My father stood up, gripping the edge of the table like he needed to steady himself. You think this is over? He muttered. You think you can just embarrass us like this? I almost laughed. Embarrass you? You were the ones who tried to kick me out of my own house. You lied, manipulated, and even faked a pregnancy. Emily flinched. There it was. The slip. Her eyes darted to mine, but she recovered quickly. Too quickly. You're lying, she snapped. How dare you accuse me of something like that? I tilted my head. Then prove it. For the first time that night, Emily hesitated. Daniel's face drained of color. His eyes flickered to our parents, searching for backup. My mother reached for Emily's hand. Sweetheart, don't listen to her. She's just trying to distract us. Emily jerked her hand away. No, she's not. She knows. Patricia froze. My father muttered a curse under his breath. Emily turned to Daniel, her voice now a frantic whisper. You said no one would find out. I felt the first twinge of something like sympathy, but it was buried under the weight of years of betrayal. You faked a pregnancy, I said. Not a question. A statement. Emily opened her mouth. Closed it. Finally, she exhaled sharply. I didn't have a choice. That made me laugh. You had plenty of choices, Emily. You just chose the one that let you steal from me. You don't understand, she snapped. Daniel lost his job. We had nothing left. Mom and Dad promised that we could have the house. They said you'd just give it up. I shook my head, my stomach twisting. This wasn't just Emily's greed. This was my parents enabling her all over again. You could have asked me for help, I said, softer this time. Emily's face twisted with something like shame. I didn't think you'd say yes. So you stole instead? A tear slipped down her cheek. Mom said you didn't deserve it. She said grandfather only left it to you because you manipulated him, because you spent more time with him than we did. I inhaled sharply. It was so like our mother to twist something good into something ugly. But before I could respond, Daniel stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. We're done here, he snapped. Come on, Emily. She didn't move. Emily, he repeated, voice tight. Let's go. Her eyes flickered to mine. And for the first time, I saw hesitation. Daniel scoffed, grabbing his coat. This is a mistake, he muttered. You'll regret this, Rebecca. Funny, I said, my voice even. That's exactly what I was going to say to you. Daniel stormed out. My parents exchanged a dark glance before following him. Emily lingered. And then, just as she turned to leave, she looked back. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with something else. Something that looked a lot like doubt. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared. No, fear wasn't an issue anymore. I had spent too many years being overlooked, being pushed aside while my family handed everything to Emily. What kept me awake was the realization that this wasn't over. I knew my parents. I knew Emily. And I knew they wouldn't walk away quietly. Sure enough, the next morning, my phone rang. I stared at my father's name on the screen, debating whether to ignore it. But I already knew how this would play out. They wouldn't stop until I gave them the reaction they wanted. So I answered, Rebecca. His voice was cold and clipped, like I had personally offended him. I stayed silent, waiting for the next move. Your mother is beside herself, he continued. You humiliated us last night. You could have handled this privately. I almost laughed. You mean I could have let you steal my house in peace? His voice sharpened. That attitude is exactly why we've had problems with you. Family helps family. Funny how that only applies when you need something from me. A long pause. I could hear him breathing through his nose, barely containing his frustration. We're speaking with a lawyer, he finally said. There's no way Henry would have left the house to you alone. He was manipulated. I cut him off. Stop. You and I both know grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. He recorded the meetings. He made it legally airtight. You don't have a case. Silence. Then, softer this time, like he was trying a different approach. Rebecca, thing about Emily. She has nowhere to go now. She's pregnant. She's not pregnant, I snapped. His tone didn't even waver. That's what you think. My stomach twisted. They were still keeping up the lie. Even after last night. Even after Emily all but admitted it was a scam. I took a deep breath. I don't care what you try, Dad. The house is mine. You can waste your money on a lawyer, but it won't change anything. His voice dropped to a low, threatening whisper. You will regret this. I hung up. I expected the legal threats. What I didn't expect was Emily knocking on my door that evening. She looked different. Not smug. Not entitled. Just lost. I let her in, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe part of me wanted to see if she would try one last manipulation. Or maybe, deep down, I hoped she might finally tell the truth. She stepped into the living room, wringing her hands together. I didn't tell them I was coming here, she admitted. I didn't reply, just folded my arms and waited. She let out a shaky breath. I don't know what to do. I tilted my head. What do you mean? I mean Daniel's furious. Mom and Dad are acting like I betrayed them just by leaving with him last night. And I don't know if I even want to go back. That surprised me. You always go back, I said carefully. Emily's face crumpled, her voice small.
Yeah.
I do. For the first time, she wasn't trying to convince me of something. She wasn't playing a role. She was just Emily. And it hit me, then, she had never made a real decision for herself. Not once. I sighed and walked to the kitchen, grabbing 2 cups. Coffee. She blinked, caught off guard. You're offering me coffee? Just take it before I change my mind. She hesitated, then sat down at the table, wrapping her hands around the cup like she needed something to hold on to. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Daniel lost his job 4 months ago. He didn't tell me at first. He kept making it seem like he was just between projects, but she shook her head. We were drowning. We maxed out our credit cards. We stopped making mortgage payments. When I found out, I told Mom, and she said you'd never let me struggle. She said you'd just give me the house if you thought I needed it. My grip tightened around my coffee mug. So, she told you to fake a pregnancy? Emily nodded, looking ashamed. She said you'd never question it, that you'd feel guilty. A bitter laugh slipped out of me. She really thinks that little of me. Emily looked down. I think she believes her own lies at this point. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Emily looked up, her voice almost hesitant. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but what do I do now? I exhaled slowly. It would have been easy to say, not my problem, and send her on her way. But the truth was, I wasn't like our parents. I wasn't like Daniel. I wasn't a taker. I set my coffee down. The guest house in the backyard. It's empty. Emily frowned. I don't understand. You can rent it, I said simply. Market rate. No special treatment. If you want a real fresh start, this is it. But it has to be your decision, not Mom's. Not Daniel's. Yours. Her breath hitched. Daniel will never agree to that. I shrugged. Then maybe it's time to ask yourself if Daniel is part of your fresh start. She looked away, but I saw the way her shoulders tensed. The way her fingers dug into her mug. She already knew the answer. I'll think about it, she whispered. And for the first time in our lives, I believed her. Emily left that night without giving me an answer. I didn't push her. I knew this had to be her choice, not Daniel's, not our parents'. For once in her life, she needed to decide something for herself. I expected her to disappear for a while, maybe even go back to Daniel and let him decide for her. But the next morning, I found her sitting on my porch, a single duffel bag at her feet. I told him I'm leaving, she said, her voice quiet but steady. And he didn't try to stop me. I studied her carefully, looking for signs of doubt, hesitation. There was none. She had made her choice. I nodded once. Then let's get you settled. The guest house wasn't much, but it was comfortable. A small kitchen, a cozy bedroom, enough space for someone starting over. As I led Emily inside, she looked around like she couldn't believe it was real. You can stay here under a standard lease, I reminded her. No family favors. No manipulation. Just a fresh start. Emily gave me a small, wobbly smile. That sounds nice, actually. It was strange, seeing her like this. Not entitled. Not smug. Just grateful. The next few weeks were quiet. No calls from Daniel. No desperate messages from my parents trying to fix things. I knew why. They were waiting. Waiting for Emily to realize she had made a mistake. Waiting for her to come crawling back. But she didn't. Instead, she started helping around the house. One evening, I found her in the backyard, trimming the overgrown hedges, something neither of us had done since grandfather passed. Another afternoon, she was in the kitchen, flipping through one of his old cookbooks like she actually cared about the memories attached to it. She was learning how to be her own person. Then one evening, my phone buzzed. A message from our mother. Family meeting. Sunday at 3 p.m. Your father and I have made some decisions. Attendance is mandatory. I stared at the message for a long time before showing it to Emily. She read it twice, her expression unreadable.
Then she sighed.
They're never going to stop, are they? I smirked.
No.
But this time, we get to decide how it ends. Sunday came faster than expected. When we arrived at our parents' house, Daniel was already there, sitting stiffly beside my father. He barely glanced at Emily. The tension was thick as we sat down. My mother didn't bother with pleasantries. We've spoken to a lawyer, she announced, hands folded tightly in her lap. There may still be a way to contest the deed. I snorted. There isn't. My father leaned forward, jaw tight. This isn't about legalities, Rebecca. This is about family. There was again that word. Emily stiffened beside me. For the first time, she wasn't on their side. My mother sighed, shaking her head like we were the unreasonable ones. We're trying to make things right. No, I said flatly. You're trying to control the situation again, just like you always have. My father turned to Emily, his voice suddenly gentler. Sweetheart, you've always been the responsible one. You understand why this house should stay in the family, right? I braced myself, but Emily surprised me. She straightened, meeting his gaze without wavering. You mean stay in your control, she said. Because it already is in the family. It's in Rebecca's name. Grandfather wanted it that way. And I think for the first time he actually made the right choice. My mother paled. My father stiffened. Daniel muttered a curse under his breath. And just like that, the entire family dynamic shifted. You're choosing her over us? My mother whispered. Emily exhaled slowly, like she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. I'm choosing me, she corrected. Silence. Then Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're making a mistake, Emily, he said through clenched teeth. You're throwing everything away. Emily looked at him, calmer than I had ever seen her. Maybe I am, she admitted. But at least it's my mistake to make. He scoffed, grabbing his coat. You'll regret this. She didn't flinch. Maybe. But not as much as I'd regret going back to you. Daniel stormed out. My father followed, muttering something under his breath. My mother just sat there, staring at Emily like she couldn't recognize her own daughter. Grandfather was right about you. I told my mother as I stood. You never wanted to build something of your own. You just wanted to take what someone else had already built. She didn't reply. Emily and I walked out together, the cool evening air wrapping around us as we left that house behind. 3 months later, Emily officially filed for divorce. She started taking business classes, something she had always wanted to do but never pursued because it wasn't glamorous enough for our parents. She even started helping me organize real estate events. She was learning how to stand on her own without our parents' help. And then one day I got another message from our mother. Can I visit? I'd like to talk. Emily read over my shoulder and smirked. Think she's finally realizing she can't control everything? Maybe, I murmured. Or maybe she's just lonely now that she has no one left to manipulate. But I let her visit anyway. Because I wasn't like her. I wasn't like Daniel or my father. I didn't push people away just because they had made mistakes. And when she arrived, looking smaller and older than I remembered, she handed me a small, crumpled envelope. Inside was grandfather's old lemon square recipe. I thought maybe we could bake them together, she said softly. Emily raised an eyebrow. You never even let me see this recipe before. I know, my mother admitted. I'm trying. And maybe she was. Maybe, after all of this, we could finally break the cycle. Later that night, as I stood in the backyard watching Emily arrange flowers in front of her tiny guest house, I felt something I never thought I'd feel around my family.
Peace.
The house was still mine. My life was still mine. But for the first time, it wasn't about keeping something from them. It was about building something better than what we had before. Maybe that was the real inheritance after all.